Stuff we use year-round in Houston. Air conditioning.
You guys getting some cool air back there?
Yep.
We use our grills.
All right, dinner's almost ready.
And yet we definitely always use our common sense.
Trying to make a program that would have common sense.
Common sense isn't so common.
No, it just makes so much sense.
So right now, join lifelong Houstonian Bill King as we take on the issues with a little bit of Houston common sense.
Common sense.
It's time for Common Sense.
This is Common Sense with Bill King. Here's Bill.
Hey everybody, this is Bill King back with another edition of Common Sense Talk Radio. Today we're going to be talking about the City of Houston's budget. The city is on a June 30th fiscal year, so every year in June, before the end of June, they have to adopt their budget. And I've got two gentlemen today with me who are deep in the middle of this process right now. One is our city controller, Chris Brown, and the other is council member Edward J. Pollard. Ed's a brand new councilman, rookie council member, but he ended up as the vice chair of the very important Budget Financial Affairs Committee. So Chris and Ed, welcome to both of you to Common Sense.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me.
You bet, Chris. You know, I was every time I think about you, I always have to think about your dad. I knew him, of course, a long time before I knew you, and spent many hours talking over various city issues with your dad from time to time. For those of you who don't know, Chris's dad was Peter Brown, a council member, longtime activist on a whole lot of issues in here town. And, Chris, every time I drive past and I see a big bundle of ugly wires hanging over a street, I think about your dad's campaign against litter on a stick. I don't know if you remember that or not, but that was one of his big causes. Yeah. You know, the thing I like about your dad, Chris, was, you know, he and I frequently disagreed about things, but he was the kind of guy that you could have a disagreement over policy, and then you would go at the end of the day and have a glass of wine and talk about art or some other comment, and he never took anything personally. It was always good-natured about it, and that's something I really loved about him, and I miss him a lot.
Yeah, well, I appreciate those comments. Yeah, he was a great guy. He cared deeply about Houston, and I miss him as well.
Sure. So, Chris, can we start just a minute to talk about, there's been quite a bit in the press about the budget this year. City Council will have to adopt a budget by June 30th. How are you thinking about this year's budget? We know it's challenging. It's always challenging. But how much more so this year than other years? And is this extremist that we're in right now, is that something you think is restricted to this year, or is this a longer-term problem?
Well, first and foremost, I think this is a unique situation that we're finding ourselves in from a budgetary standpoint for this fiscal year, and this will continue and, in my estimation, get maybe worse over time, and I'll explain why. First and foremost, we're dealing with the coronavirus, and we've had businesses and citizens shut in, stay at home for, now 8-9 weeks, I think it's been almost. So that's had a big economic impact on downturn in economic activity, so downturn in sales tax, all the different revenue sources that we get from the city. But the other thing that has been a result of that, that's, I say, the double whammy for Houston, is that as a result of no one out there moving around and driving and flying, oil prices have tanked. So we've seen, oil prices actually went negative last month, which is, I think, the first time maybe in history. So we're kind of getting it from both sides. We're getting an economic downturn from the coronavirus, and then that also in turn has exacerbated what was already kind of a sluggish oil market. So, we're seeing a real big hit this year in our revenue for this end of this fiscal year. We're going to see a hit next fiscal year, FY21, that starts, as you mentioned, July 1st. And then we'll see in FY22 the impact from property taxes because, as you know, the property tax appraisals are as of January 1st, and then we receive that money in December or even January of the following year. So it's probably going to take until January of 2022 before we actually see that downturn in property tax. And property tax is about 50% of our revenue, whereas sales tax is about 29%. So property tax is a much larger portion of our overall revenue. So for that going down, that hits us even harder.
Yeah, I was actually looking at that back in 2008, 2009, and you're right. The property tax decline lag the recession by about a year, but the sales tax effect is almost immediately, which is kind of what we're seeing this time. You know, Ed, I get this is kind of baptism by fire for you. You're walking into your first budget cycle here. How are you feeling about it? Is it coming at you so fast, or what's your reaction to the budget process so far?
It's definitely coming fast, but at the end of the day, since you know there's a shot clock, you have to get it done. And so we are scrubbing the budget, looking for any way in which we can close that gap. The mayor has put out some proposals on ways he can close that gap that I think we're going to go forward with. But you have to get it done one way or the other. You don't have a choice. And so by July 1, we'll have something that I think will sustain us going forward.
Chris, I know that you all get advice from Bill Gilmer and a lot of other people, and I'm curious about how you're thinking about the effect of the oil price decline versus the virus. I mean, it seems like to me the virus is probably a 1 year, 2 year kind of event, but I worry that the oil price may be much longer. You know, back in the 80s when we had that collapse in oil prices, I know you weren't around at the time, but unfortunately I was around at the time, and I remember it was almost a decade before the oil prices came back. What are your consultants and people that you rely on advice for telling you about how we should be thinking about the energy sector in Houston? Is this a short-term problem or a long-term problem?
Well, first and foremost, actually, I was here in Houston in the 80s. I was about 10 years old when we went through that last cycle, so too young to really remember. But I do remember, you mentioned my father. He was an architect, owned his own practice, and, I mean, things just shut down in Houston. And back then we were about, I think 80+% of our economy was dependent on oil and gas. We've done a great job over the last few decades to diversify our economy, and now we're a little over 40% of our economy is directly tied to oil and gas. But we're looking at building some models internally. We're taking some of the analysis from Bill Gilmer, as you mentioned, from the Greater Houston Partnership, Mike Lofton, who's a consultant that does forecasting for us, and kind of putting all those together, plus using some information. I sit on the National League of Cities board, so I'm in contact, and I'm the finance chair for that group. So talking to other cities and seeing kind of what their calculations are. But overall, we are expecting to see pretty steep decline in sales tax as a result of coronavirus, and then it will probably rebound once we get people back to work and kind of get past the coronavirus. But the double whammy effect for Houston is then the oil downturn. We're still $20 oil, although I think we've moved up to the high 20s this week. But not a lot of companies can make money, at $28 oil. So
yeah, that feels like
that's going to be.
Yeah, that feels like me. That's going to be a much longer term problem.
Well, and so this is what we're looking at. We did a stress test that my office authored earlier this year. Timing was very good. It was before actually the coronavirus took hold. And we modeled 3 different past scenarios. We modeled the dot-com bust in 2000, late 2000. We modeled the 08-09 financial crisis, and then we modeled the 14-15 oil bust. Of those 3 models, the Great Recession in 08-09 was the one that had the most financial impact to the city of Houston. We lost about $100 million in revenue in the subsequent year to 2 years after that initially took hold. And really, we said that we think that the coronavirus could be as bad or worse than the 08-09 crisis. So,
Now,
from
Chris,
the controller's perspective.
Let me ask you to hold it right there for just a second. We've got to take a quick break.
Sure.
We'll be back here, folks, in just a few minutes to follow up on this conversation about what do we think these two double barrel crisis we're looking at going to do to city revenues. Right back with more Common Sense Talk Radio. This is Bill King. We're back with more Common Sense Talk Radio. Our guest today, City Controller Chris Brown, City Council Member Ed Pollard, and we're talking about the city's budget. Chris, I had to cut you off there a little bit talking about the revenue projections. Let's go back to that for a second. And we're talking about the general fund, I assume, and you were mentioning that property taxes are about half of that, and that is probably pretty stable for this year because those numbers are really baked into last year. But the sales tax is what you're having to deal with this year. So what are y'all seeing on the sales tax numbers right now?
Well, on sales tax, the first indication we've got is we got March sales tax. Those were down a little bit over 10%. So it's a pretty steep decline. I can't remember that we've had a 10% down, but the issue with that is that we really only had maybe 10 days of March where we were at the stay at home. It's really going to be April that we look at that we'll see the real impact. And we're hoping, those numbers are, not too far down. But overall, we did have to reduce our sales tax revenue in this fiscal year that, as you said, ends June 30th. We reduced those numbers by about $23 million. So we're taking a hit, this year. And then, my office is expecting a pretty substantial hit in sales tax for the next fiscal year that starts July 1st.
Yeah, so just to sort of help the audience here, we get early in the month, we get a number from the state, like we got this in the first part of May, but that is for March sales because it's reported a month in arrears, so we haven't seen the April numbers yet. And I agree with you, it seems like April's going to be quite a bit worse than March was, and May we'll just have to see. We started doing some reopening. Can you give us a little idea about where do the sales taxes come from in the city? Is it retail sales? Is it the use tax? Have y'all got some kind of feel for how much of this might be affected and how much of it might not?
Well, when we look at sales tax that the city receives, and again, it's that portion of the 8.25% that you pay as consumers. We get about 6.5% of that at the city. Half of it is business to business, so a lot of that is oil and gas related activity. The other half is, retail, whether that's internet sales or dining out at restaurants or shopping and things like that. But overall, a lot of that activity has been greatly reduced. So we're seeing, as we saw in the March numbers, a 10% downturn, and that was month over month. So for March of 2019, we were actually down 10% from March. Now, the good news is we thought in the controller's office that we could be down as much as 15% in March. So it wasn't as bad as we anticipated. So a common theme that we've developed in the controller's office is financially we really need to plan for the worst and then hope for the best. Because if we plan to have our revenues, substantially down and luckily it doesn't end up turning out to be that bad, then we end up having more money than we expected, which is a good place to be in.
And we were actually coming off a number of months of fairly good sales tax increases, right? As I recall, we'd had a pretty good year up until this coronavirus hit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were tracking over 5% year over year rolling increase in sales tax. We had estimated a little under 1% increase. We were pretty conservative, just thinking that because of the slow oil markets that it might not take off. But we've got a very resilient and strong economy in Houston, so that's a great thing to have. But no one is immune from the coronavirus when you shut the entire economy down.
Let me ask you, it looks like to me that the budget that the administration brought forward is assuming about a 3% decline in sales tax for next year. Does that sound about right, Ed?
Yes.
And are you comfortable with that level? Do you think that's realistic, or is that maybe a little optimistic?
I think it could be realistic. Everything has to really determine on human behavior. We don't actually know how the coronavirus is going to affect people being able to go back out and about and feel comfortable spending dollars on retail or food or whatever. You still have a lot of places that are completely shut down. And then with the places that are open, like malls and restaurants, they're at a 25% occupancy rate. So I think going in right now, you just kind of have to look at the data and assume, but nobody really knows for sure because we don't understand human behavior yet. It's going to take several more weeks of being able to see patterns to have a better idea where we are.
So, Chris, you were talking about some projections before the break. How do you feel about that 3% decline for next year?
Well, I think it's really tough to model these things. I think based on what we've seen from our consultants, what we've seen from kind of national economists and from what's happening in other cities, that's a pretty low number. In the sense that we're estimating in the controller's office that we'll actually see a much larger decrease in sales tax for next year. I hope we're wrong. I think a lot of it, as Councilmember Pollard said, it's dependent on human behavior. I mean, if we, and we're starting to, in other parts of the country reopen, but if, next month in Houston, the mayor decides, hey, I think based on the data that they're seeing, it's okay to start opening everything back up, and economic activity goes right back to where it was, and we get, sales tax back. It's possible we could have a, 3% decrease for next year, but again, we're kind of planning for the worst and hoping for the best. So, we're going to be giving our trends report this Thursday of this week, and we'll be outlining all of our projections. We're still finalizing those now, but I can tell you right now, the sales tax ours is lower than the 3%.
Yeah, I know we had about a 3% decline, I believe, back in 2009, 2010. This sure feels like it's going to be a lot more impact than that because it so directly affects retail. One question I get a lot, Chris, is where are we on internet sales these days? Are we getting that sales tax revenue now? Are we capturing that? What's the current status?
Yeah, there was a Supreme Court case dealing with Wayfair, which is an online retailer. And in that, the Supreme Court basically said that, the cities need to be able to receive the revenue from customers that essentially are where they receive that product, as opposed to where it's originating, where it's being shipped from. So, Texas buys a lot. Texans and Houstonians buy a lot of things online. So we are receiving that through the state. I think there's still some ironing out of specifics of how each different locality receives their money, but we have seen, I think, in talking with the state comptroller's office recently, we saw an increase, I think, in December, and a lot of that was attributed to that sales tax from online revenue.
Yeah, I was wondering whether or not some of the improvement this year might not be from capturing more of that revenue. I mean, I think I get a package every day from Amazon these days, and it really seems like the city ought to be getting the benefit.
You sound like my wife.
Of that sales tax. One thing I want to talk about for a second, the property tax. We have a property tax cap in the city, which basically limits the total property tax receipts to this year's collections plus whatever the population growth is for the city and inflation. And obviously, population growth and inflation have both been very low, so that limit is now pretty low. We've hit that for the last, I think, Chris, 4 or 5 years now, and the city's been forced to actually reduce the tax rate to keep from going over the total property tax cap. What are your thoughts about how that's going to work out this year?
Well, I think we will hit the cap. We've hit it. I think it's actually been the last 7 years that we've actually hit that cap. I expect us to hit it this year. And part of the reason is that, as you alluded to, Bill, is that the calculation takes in CPI and population growth. And looking at the CPI numbers that were released recently, and that's a consumer price index, so that's basically the rate at which prices for goods and services are increasing. It's been really, really moderate. It's been around 1%. I think we're at 1.27% change in CPI. So the other factor of that is change in population. And although Houston is doing, or up until coronavirus, Houston was doing quite well economically, we really didn't have that much population growth. Most of the growth is actually outside of the city limits. So we only saw about 2/3 of 1%, 67% increase. I think only about 15,000 people year over year increase in population. So when you don't have a lot of inflation and you don't have a lot of population growth, it tends to keep that maximum allowable number lower, and so therefore I think we're going to hit it. As you alluded to, one of the things, byproducts of the Prop 1 revenue cap is that we have to lower the tax rate if those appraisals come in very high, and we don't have a robust population and inflation numbers. We essentially have to lower the tax rate. So we've Since I think Bill White was in office, the tax rate was about 63.875 cents per $1,000 of valuation, and now we've dropped that substantially. We're at about 58 cents the last time I checked.
Well, my appraisal was way up this year, Chris, so you may be forced to do that. Let's take a quick break, and we'll come right back and continue this conversation about the property tax cap. Be right back, folks. Hello, we're back. Bill King, Common Sense Talk Radio. We're here with City Controller Chris Brown, City Council Member Ed Pollard. We're talking about the budget. And Chris and Ed, just before the break, we were talking about the property tax cap and that City Council will be forced to lower the tax rate again this year. Chris, I know that there's a provision in that charter amendment that provides some emergency power. If you're in a state of emergency, there's some ability to increase property taxes without going out for a vote. Have you thought about that any? Does that apply to this situation?
I think that could apply to this situation. The challenge, I think, is that you can only do it once every, and I have to get clarity on the rules. It's either every 12 months or every fiscal year. We did actually include a small portion of money for Tropical Storm Imelda, which was both declared a disaster by the state and federal, so we qualified for that. So we were able to raise it. That was back in, I believe, September or October of 2019. So I think we could do that. We'd have to check on the timing because it might not be possible just because it might be too close to the Imelda disaster.
Yeah. Ed, have you heard any conversation about that at all?
I have not. That hasn't come up at all. I think that when it's voter approved, that would be like a last resort. We'll try to find every other way to cut that budget shortfall than having to do that. And so those conversations have not come up yet.
Okay. Chris, I want to change topics for just a second. And the city uses this fund accounting, which is just this incredibly complicated system where we have things divided up into different funds. And the general fund is primarily what we've been talking about. That's what we pay for police and fire and garbage and a whole lot of those things. But we have some other important funds. We have the water and sewer system, the combined utility system, then we have the airport system. Can you talk for a second about what those funds are going to look like and to what degree the virus and the oil price downturn might have on these other big funds that are really important to us?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think, as Councilmember Pollard knows, a lot of times people are just focused on the general fund. When I give my report every month, most of the time people are asking questions about the general fund, which again is the operating budget. But we do also have enterprise funds. We refer to those as business type activities because they actually generate enough revenue to sustain themselves. And the scary part is if you have an economic shock where they can't sustain themselves for whatever reason, ultimately then the general fund would have to step in and be able to provide liquidity to those systems. So you mentioned some concerns, and those were initially some concerns I had specifically around the airport and the convention entertainment facility now termed Houston First Corporation, just because from what we've seen, people are not flying. The passenger traffic for airline embarkment has dropped, 90+%. And as a result of them not flying and not traveling, a lot of them aren't going to hotels. And that's, the biggest source of revenue from the airports really is the passenger traffic from the flights. They also get rental car and, concessions and all those things. But again, those are all connected. And same with on the convention entertainment facility side, the hotel occupancy tax or hot tax is one of the basically primary generators of their income, their revenue. So we've seen a huge drop in hotel bookings in the city, and none of the conventions, they've all canceled. So both of those areas, are definitely vulnerable. The good news is that through the federal government's CARES package, and that's the funding for the coronavirus response, both the airport system and Houston First has received funds to help offset some of the expenses and revenue loss that's associated with coronavirus. So that'll help bolster those. But, it's only probably in the short term. We need to hope that all that stuff gets back online so that they can continue to generate those revenues so they can have funding for their ongoing operations.
So that's something else we really need to be keeping an eye on as we go through the year here, because that, as you say, could put additional pressure on the general fund if we end up having a bad problem over there.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Okay. Let me just ask you, make sure I've got my numbers here right. It looks like to me we started the general fund with around $320 million in surplus. The projection, I think, that your office has come out, we're going to be down to about $250 at the end of this fiscal year, and the next budget is going to take us down to something around $100 million, I guess. Am I right on those numbers? And I'm just curious how both of you feel about whether or not we ought to be sort of cutting it that close. Chris, let me start with you, and then Ed, I want you to be thinking about that while Chris is answering.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult situation we're in right now. I think something I've been advocating for is the structurally balanced budget, which is essentially just not spending more than you're taking in revenue. There's been an ongoing practice, and this goes back, decades. I think I looked back 20 years that, we always sell a piece of property, or we take money from a particular fund, or we use a little bit of money from savings to balance our budget every year. So, that's not an unusual practice, I think, in government, but it's not a financially sustainable practice in the long run, because eventually you have what is happening right now. You have a downturn in the economy, and you don't have extra revenues to help use that to offset a budget deficit in the next fiscal year. So to your numbers, we're expecting, I think, the fund balance for FY 20 to be around $250 million. We'll see a large drawdown per the mayor's budget that he proposed. I think they're using $98 million of that. And our estimates, because we have a little bit larger decrease in sales tax, we're thinking that the budget deficit's going to be a little bit larger. So that the challenge there is that you really don't want to go below the 7.5%. I think this proposed budget goes just underneath that by maybe, a few tenths of a percentage point. But the challenge, again, is that if those sales tax revenue projections are not conservative enough, and it ends up being that we, are down 5 or 6% in sales tax, most of the money that's going to come to bridge the gap is going to be out of the savings account. So, it would be my preference that we're
also wiping out the rainy day fund, correct?
Yes, I think that's part of the proposed budget.
Yeah.
Which,
hurricane season starts here in 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's it's a very difficult situation right now. I mean, we've had since 2015 the downturn in oil. The economy really hasn't been as robust as it has been up until 14, and even then we were still trying to recover from the 08-09 financial crisis, but. I think that the bright side, and this is something that I've personally experienced, the mayor and the administration, they do tend to budget their expenditures pretty conservatively. It seems like we always have a really wide difference. I think we were, even a few months ago, we were maybe $25 million difference, and we've narrowed that quite a bit towards the end of the fiscal year because they've had some savings in departments and things like that. But the problem is if you have a downturn, let's say a 5% in sales tax, and then you have a 3% downturn in property tax for FY 22, those numbers start to become so large that you can't just make up that difference from savings and departmental budgets. You have to actually do, big cuts. And I know the mayor proposed some pretty large cuts for this, like deferring cadet classes and things like that. So it's a difficult, it's a tough
furloughs, yeah. But I just wonder. I mean, I put both of y'all on the spot here a little bit. I mean, companies all over the city are cutting employees, or they're cutting back on their workforces. And I don't think there's any organization in the world that you can't reduce the headcount by some amount. And the truth of the matter is, the only thing we're really doing here is some fairly modest furloughs, and then reducing those police cadet classes, which means that we'll have fewer police officers, at the end of the year. Should we be looking at other cuts, Ed? I mean, I know we've got a sustainability czar, we've got a fitness czar, we've got all these things that seem to me to be less critical than police and fire. Should we be cutting deeper to make sure that we don't get into trouble if we have that sales tax drop?
Yeah, so I think the last thing we want to do is lay people off completely, because every person is tied to a family, and the family is tied to the economy. And once you start laying people off, then things could get worse than what they are. I think we just have to dive deep into our budget and look at this coronavirus as an opportunity, as a gift and a curse. The gift is now we're going to be able to really scrub that budget and see how lean we can get, how efficient we can get with the dollars. As opposed to if things were just bright and sunny, we wouldn't be pressured to have to do that. And so I think collectively as a council, we'll be doing that over the next several weeks, and I think we'll be able to find the cuts to make us go forward strong.
Chris, how do you feel about getting right down to that 7.5%? Should we cutting it that close?
It makes me a little uncomfortable, honestly. I think, again, you just have to be very, very certain that your revenue estimates are going to be spot on. And I don't think anyone can predict. I mean, talking with Dr. Bill Gilmer, he said, look, this is, modeling for coronavirus is very difficult. No one has ever experienced anything like this.
Right.
One of the things, and I think there's another way to address this problem, and we have seen most recently, I think in the last 3 weeks, we received $404 million from the federal government for the CARES, which again is the coronavirus relief funding. Initially, the guidelines were very restrictive, but they have come out with guidelines subsequently, and they've said that we could use that money to offset some of the budgeted expenses for public safety, for healthcare workers. So one of the things that, and I know the mayor and
maybe a little bit of a life raft for us.
Yeah, they're digesting this, is that it might be possible, because in talking with the police and fire folks, they said, look, my guys are all out dealing with coronavirus stuff.
Yeah.
A large portion of it. So that's an expense that we're incurring that we didn't budget for, even though it's regular payroll.
Okay.
Healthcare workers are 100% dealing with coronavirus. So, we've got this $404 million. We really need to make sure we have a good plan of how we're going to utilize it, because after December 30th of this year, it has to be returned if it hasn't been spent. So one of the things I think that is an option that the city is looking at is how could we utilize some of this funding to essentially cover some of the expenditures that we have around the coronavirus, and that in turn can help us have a little bit more dollars and kind of bridge that gap.
Okay, we got to take a quick break, Chris. We'll be right back. And when we come back, I want to talk to you all about pensions and what effect this is going to have on our 2017 pension deals. Bill King, Common Sense Talk Radio. We'll be right back, folks. Hang on. This is Bill King. We're back with more Common Sense Talk Radio. We're talking with City Controller Chris Brown and the Vice Chair of the Budget Financial Affairs Committee, Council Member Edward Pollard. And guys, I want to talk a little bit about the pensions, because this has been sort of the big elephant in the room at the city for years now. We've been dealing with this. We had a rework of the pensions back in 2017, got our liabilities down some. And one critical thing that we did was we reduced the assumption rate, what we assumed the assets in the plan were going to earn, down from in excess of 8 to 7%. And Chris, my recollection is the first year we made that, we made a little over that. The second year we're a little bit below it, but it sure looks like we're going to miss it by a bunch this year. Do you agree with that? And then can we talk about what the consequences of that are?
Yeah, well, I think anybody that's been watching the markets can see that, still on the S&P, we've had a nice bounce overall in the broader markets, but we're down substantially for the year. And as a result, I would expect the pensions, most of those pension funds will probably miss that 7% this year. The good news is we do most of the funding, the actuarial funding, we smooth those returns over a 5-year period. So that can help kind of offset, and it's still early in the year. So if the market keeps coming back, it's a chance that, we can make up some of that ground. But, if the challenge would be is if we had multiple years like this, 2 or 3 in a row, it would bring that 5-year average way down.
Yeah, I think the only one that I know that puts out any interim numbers is the police plan, and I think they said that through the end of March they were like a -5 or 6 or something. So, that will obviously bring the average way down. As I recall, it's like a 5-year rolling average. Is that right, Chris?
Mm-hmm. That's correct. Yeah, they call it smoothing, but it's basically a rolling average.
Yeah. What are if we keep missing the 7%? What are the consequences? What happens under the new pension plan?
Well, one of the things you remember we did in the reform plan, we went 16 years previously where we were accruing these large unfunded liabilities, and essentially the city was on the hook for 100% of that. So what we did in this reform package is we said, let's build a mechanism that shares some of that risk with the employees and the pension groups. So essentially we set up what's called the risk corridor, and it basically is a range of returns. And essentially if we end up moving above or below that, we make adjustments. So if we ended up moving the city as a percentage, and it gets a little complicated, but it's a percentage of payroll. If the percentage of payroll every year that we contribute, if that went above a certain percent, and it would have to go above like 5%, then we would trigger a renegotiation with the pension funds, and we would say, okay, well, we should be putting in, let's say it's $100 million to get us back to the midpoint of the corridor. Well, the pension funds would essentially have to pick up part of that cost. So it's a way to kind of protect the city a little bit from what happened previously, which is just every year getting hit with a huge bill.
Yeah, I can understand that, but the thing that the question I always had about that plan was it basically requires the employees to put in more money, and police and fire are already putting in about 10% of their salary. It's just hard for me to imagine how you ask them to put in more than 10% of their salary into the plan, and I wonder, look, we're already having a hard time recruiting police officers. If you're asking people to put in 15% or something of their salary, do you really think we're going to be able to recruit police officers in the future? Ed, have y'all talked about this in your committee at all and how these numbers are looking?
Not only the pension, but when I'm talking to Chris through his budget presentations, the other post-employment benefits, there are other pension costs that are out there that are looming that we'll have to get a handle over soon, because we don't want to be like some of these other major cities around the country that pensions has been the reason that they have been taken down and had to file for bankruptcy. And so it's a big deal, something that we have to control. Chris, you want to get in on the other post-employment benefits and where we stand on that?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's something that Ed, you and I have discussed in private. We've discussed in the committee. The pensions also have a health care portion for the retirees, and that other post-employment benefit is basically the retiree health care. So for folks that have retired but aren't Medicare eligible because they're not old enough yet, they essentially get funding from the city through this fund. And right now we have about a $2.3 billion unfunded pension liability for the other post-employment benefits. So that's growing, and the concern, and I voiced this in the Budget and Fiscal Affairs committees and when I come and make my presentations, we just don't want to let this thing go for another 15 or 20 years, because every year we're adding almost $200 million to the unfunded liability. I will say I've had lots of discussions with Mayor Sylvester Turner about this. He is also concerned. We have been looking at setting up a kind of a reform plan and looking at different options like OPEB trust, and this would allow us to basically greatly reduce the unfunded liability and have predictability for the employees and predictability for the city. So that's really ultimately where we want to be. But we have to find the money to be able to fund a program like that. And right now, money is tight, so that might get tabled for another year or so until we can get the economy going again.
And I think that's why, Chris, as you spoke about earlier, having a structurally balanced budget is critical. Whenever we're doing these one-time fixes, putting Band-Aids each year on our finances, it's something that we can't look forward to the next year. And so we're always trying to nickel and dime, doing patchwork of trying to find ways to close that gap. But if we had a structurally balanced budget across the board, we would be in a much better position and much more sustainable.
Well, guys,
yeah, it's a really difficult process. But if we had, and there's no way that we could have been, let's just say during my term, the last 4.5 years, that we would have been able to just flip a switch and say, okay, we're going to structurally balance our budget. But had we had done that, we would have, instead of having $250 million in our fund balance, we would have over $500 million. So it's something that we need to work towards. And again, it's just real simple, common sense. Don't spend more money than you take in revenue. The administration did hire a consultant several years ago to develop a 10-year financial sustainability plan that would get us to being structurally balanced, so we wouldn't spend more money than we take in revenue. But we need to start. We need to continue to implement all those steps. There's about 58 steps, so it's going to take time. But this is the time to do it. We're going to really have to tighten the budget down now, and then the revenues will naturally come back like they always do. So just making smart decisions going forward will help us get there in the future.
Well, guys, unbelievably, we've already spent an hour doing this. This has been a great conversation. I can't believe how fast these hours go by. You know, Chris, I hope that we do that. I will say, though, I remember back during the Neeson Barker administration when Mike Nichols carried that long-range financial committee, or task force, I guess they called it. And I think there were 73 recommendations, and the last time I looked, none of those recommendations had been implemented. So I'm a little bit pessimistic. But I hope one thing that we can look at is trying to figure out some way to consolidate some of these services going into the future. Listen, guys, we really appreciate you as coming in to talk today, and we appreciate everybody listening to another edition of Common Sense Talk Radio. We'll be back here next week at 2 o'clock on Saturday, KPRC AM 950 for another edition. We're going to be talking about the Houston restaurant scene and what's going on there and how people are trying to navigate a very difficult process of trying to run a restaurant in the city of Houston in the middle of the pandemic. Join us here again Saturday at 2 o'clock, KPRC AM 950 for another edition of Common Sense Talk Radio, because you know common sense is not all that common.